1. d4 immediately stakes a claim in the center, opening lines for the queen and a bishop, and preparing to develop the kingside pieces efficiently. This move prepares to open lines for the queen's bishop and potentially lead to various defenses, like the queen's gambit declined or the French defense, depending on white's subsequent choices. This move immediately establishes a strong central pawn presence, preparing to control key squares and potentially open lines for piece development, creating an immediate tension with black's e6 pawn. This move establishes a classical central pawn confrontation, directly challenging white's e4 pawn and aiming for an open game reminiscent of the queen's gambit. Declined. This move develops a knight actively towards the center, supporting the e4 pawn and preparing to castle, while clarifying white's intentions in this French defense variation. This move, nf6, is a very natural and common response in the queen's gambit declined, leading to main lines where black actively challenges white's central pawn on e4 and develops a key piece. This move, 4, bg5, directly challenges black's knight, aiming to disrupt the pawn structure or create tactical opportunities through a potential pin or exchange on f6. This move, 4, h6, questions white's bishop on g5, forcing a decision regarding its placement and potentially creating a weakness on the kingside for black if the bishop is exchanged. This exchange, a consequence of black's 4, h6 forcing white's hand, transforms the pawn structure by doubling black's f-pawns, potentially creating weaknesses in black's kingside defense while giving white the bishop pair. This move recaptures the bishop, developing the queen and opening the f-file for potential piece activity, though it also places the queen on a more exposed square. This capture immediately opens the center and simplifies the position, leading to a queen's pawn game structure where white often aims to exploit space in piece activity. This move develops a piece to an active square, simultaneously attacking white's central pawn on e4 and preparing to castle, while also forcing white to clarify the tension in the center. This check forces black to address the immediate threat to the king, potentially disrupting their coordination and development as the bishop aims to exploit the doubled pawns after a potential capture. This move is a principled response within the queen's gambit declined, challenging white's bishop on b5 and aiming to gain a tempo by forcing white to either retreat the bishop or capture the pawn, potentially disrupting white's pawn structure. This move, dxc6, breaks up black's pawn structure, creating doubled pawns on the c-file and opening the diagonal for white's queen. This recapture of the pawn on c6 with the knight re-establishes material equality and develops a piece, but it also weakens the pawn structure on the queenside for black. This move develops the knight to a passive square, unnecessarily hindering the development of the c1 bishop and offering less active central control, compared to a more direct development. This move, castling kingside, is a standard developing maneuver that secures the king and prepares to connect the rooks for future action. This move completes kingside castling, bringing the king to safety and connecting the rooks, which is a fundamental defensive and developmental goal in this opening. This move activates the rook on the open d-file, contesting control and preparing to pressure white's central pawns or attack the kingside. This move repositions the knight to a more active central square, preparing to challenge black's control of the d5 pawn and potentially create threats against the black king. This move repositions the queen aggressively, targeting the h2 pawn and indirectly pressuring white's kingside, while also preparing to potentially swing the queen to a more active diagonal later. This exchange on c6 creates an unbalanced pawn structure, giving white a chance to exploit black's weakened queenside pawn majority in the endgame. This recapture creates doubled pawns for black, weakening the c-file and potentially hindering the development of the queen's rook, while white gains a slight advantage in pawn structure. This move f4 aims to aggressively challenge black's central pawn majority and open lines for white's pieces, potentially targeting the weakened kingside. This move, 13, boss 6, repositions the bishop to a more active square, targeting white's queenside pawns and potentially disrupting their coordination. This move solidifies the queenside pawn structure, creating a solid foundation for white's pieces and preparing to develop the queenside knight towards the center. This retreat to f8 aims to safeguard the bishop from potential threats and reposition it to a more active diagonal, potentially supporting a kingside defense or preparing for future piece activity. This move re-centers the queen to a more flexible position, preparing to support the potential advance of the f-pawn and potentially reroute to the kingside for an attack. This move repositions the queen, aiming to pressure white's center and potentially exploit weaknesses on the kingside after white's development. This move prepares to double rooks on the f-file, creating strong pressure along an open line and potentially supporting a kingside attack. This move challenges white's central pawn structure and opens up attacking possibilities on the queenside for black. This move seizes a central pawn, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially open lines for white's pieces. This capture on c5 aims to destabilize white's pawn structure, immediately creating an isolated doubled pawn on the c-file and opening the b8-h2 diagonal for the queen. This capture on c5 opens the d-file for black's rook and creates an isolated d-pawn for white, which can become a strategic weakness if not supported. Black recaptures the pawn, opening lines for the rook on d8 and freeing the bishop on a6, aiming to complicate the position and exploit white's slightly awkward pawn structure. This move re-centralizes the knight, aiming to contest the d-file and potentially support a future e4-e5 pawn advance or pressure black's weakened c6 pawn. This move initiates an aggressive centralization of the rook, aiming to exploit the open c-file and potentially create threats against white's king or disrupt white's piece coordination. This move prevents the immediate tactical threat of black's queen gaining access to white's back rank via qxc2, while also preparing to possibly advance the g-pawn to contest the kingside. This move repositions the rook to the open d-file, aiming to increase pressure on white's d-pawn and potentially support a queenside advance or exchange on d4 to simplify the position. This move repositions the queen to a more active central square, preparing to contest the open d-file and potentially support an attack on black's kingside. This move is a bold attempt to disrupt white's central control and open lines for black's pieces, aiming to create immediate counterplay after the pawn exchange. This pawn capture opens the f-file for attacking possibilities, creating immediate pressure on black's kingside after black's recent pawn advance disrupted white's queenside structure. This recapture reopens the e-file for black's rook, potentially creating powerful attacking lines against white's king if white's queen moves to an unfavorable square or if white's central pawns become weakened further. This move centralizes the queen, preparing to exploit the exposed white king and the open c-file that will soon arise after further exchanges. The queen retreats to a safer square, maintaining contact with the e-file and preparing to defend the pawn chain if white attempts further advances. This strong knight maneuver exploits the pinned e-pawn to immediately threaten the enemy queen and simultaneously attack the weak c5 pawn, aiming to gain material or disrupt black's coordination. This move sacrifices the rook to achieve a decisive tactical advantage by forcing the exchange of queens and creating an unstoppable passed pawn. This exchange is forced by the check and captures the checking piece, simplifying the position and relieving the immediate pressure. This move forces a queen exchange in a structurally imbalanced position, offering white a respite from the immediate attack while creating potential central pawn control. For black, this move is a necessary defensive maneuver to safeguard the king from further checks along the open diagonal and to prepare for potential pawn pushes by black. The rook on d7 aims to secure the king and prepare to contest the open d-file, while also potentially supporting a future pawn push. This knight move aims to exploit the weakened kingside pawn structure and pressure the d-pawn, potentially forcing a concession or opening lines for attack. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, eyeing the king and potentially disrupting white's coordination. This move aims to reposition the queen to a more active square where it can support a potential kingside attack and also defend the f2 pawn, while simultaneously eyeing the vulnerable d5 pawn. Black's move qb1 initiates an immediate tactical threat by aiming to infiltrate white's queenside, potentially disrupting white's coordination and creating further complications. This move forces the black queen away from the crucial open d-file and allows white to consolidate, aiming to exploit the exposed king and black's disconnected pieces. This move is a forced response to white's discovered check, aiming to protect the king and avoid further immediate threats after the queen was forced to abandon its advanced post. This move activates the queen on an open diagonal, preparing to support the knight's potential advance and exert pressure on black's kingside, aiming to break through the weakened pawn structure. This move prepares to contest the open c-file and potentially create counterplay against white's king, while also defending the pawn on c5. This move prepares to exploit the open c-file and potentially attack the weak pawn on c7, while also developing initiative and threatening to trap the black queen. This move aims to reposition the bishop to a more active square, potentially defending the d7 pawn and preparing for further counterplay along the queenside. This move aggressively repositions the queen to the 8th rank, aiming to exploit the weakness on the b7 pawn and potentially create threats against black's king via the exposed d-file, while also covering the important c5 square. This move is crucial for defending against white's aggressive kingside pressure and the threat of the knight on c6 cutting off the rook's retreat. This move forces the black king to a more exposed central square, potentially leading to a decisive attack as white's pieces are well positioned to coordinate. The king is forced to abandon its protection on g8 to escape the immediate threat of the knight's discovered check, but this opens up further tactical complications and weakens the kingside. This knight sacrifice opens lines and creates a mating threat by forcing the black king into a vulnerable position, aiming to exploit the discovered attack on the queen. The king retreats to the safest square, acknowledging the immediate danger of the knight check and seeking to consolidate his position, while white's king remains vulnerable. This move aims to simplify the position by exchanging queens and entering a favorable endgame where white's more active rook on the 7th rank can exert significant pressure. This move seeks to activate the queen by bringing it to the center, potentially supporting central pawn pushes or creating threats against white's king, while also repositioning from the less active square. This move exploits the open diagonal and forces black's king to move aiming to regain the sacrificed pawn and create mating threats. This move is a passive defense after the forcing sequence. Black should aim to activate their king and potentially prepare to recapture the attacked pawn on f7. This capture on b5 is forced, winning material and simplifying the position into a winning endgame for white due to the superior pawn structure and king activity. This recapture is forced, as white's queen was threatening to deliver a mating attack on the 7th rank. This move aims to regain the pawn by attacking black's advanced rook on e7, which is currently protected only by the bishop on b5. This move re-establishes the queen's pressure along the d-file, threatening to create immediate mating threats if white's rook on e2 cannot be adequately defended. This forcing check is essential to regain the initiative and exploit the exposed black king by driving it to a corner where the discovered attack from the queen on d1 will soon be decisive. Black's king is forced to an exposed square, and white's material advantage and king safety will soon prove decisive unless black can generate immediate counterplay. This move forces the king into a more exposed position on g8, aiming to exploit the weakened light squares and prepare for further king hunting operations. This move weakens the king's pawn shield, creating potential targets on the light squares once white's knight returns to active play. This move activates the queen and prepares to exert pressure on the kingside, potentially targeting the g7 pawn or supporting a future advance of the h-pawn. This move solidifies the pawn chain and prepares to challenge white's advanced knight on e5, aiming to untangle black's position and create counterplay. This move recaptures the pawn on f6, simplifying the position and consolidating material advantage while aiming to exploit white's initiative on the kingside. This move is a desperate attempt to create counterplay by forcing exchanges, as black's king is exposed and white's pieces are well positioned to exploit it. With the capture of the rook, white has decisively won material, simplifying the game into a winning endgame by forcing the exchange of queens. The move 43, Rxd6 transitions into an endgame where white has a material advantage in pawns. But black's king is more active and white's king is still somewhat exposed. This check forces the black king onto a more exposed square, continuing the king hunt and aiming to overwhelm black's defenses. Black plays kilogram 8 to move the king away from the dangerous open file and to prepare for potential counterplay after white's imminent checks, although white's advantage is significant, with the opponent's king exposed and white having an extra pawn. Rxa7 aims to consolidate the material advantage and simplify into a winning endgame by forcing pawn exchanges.